Hello, everyone. My name is Professor Michael Curry. I'm a professor of theater at Goucher College in Towson, Maryland. This talk is called The Glover's Son, the unlikely story of how Shakespeare became famous. I first presented this presentation to the Baltimore Bibliophiles on November 15th, 2017 at the Johns Hopkins University Club. And I want to thank my friends at the Baltimore Bibliophiles for inviting me. The purpose of the invitation, I think, was that we had just celebrated the 400th anniversary of Shakespeare's death the previous year in 2016. And I think that we can agree that Shakespeare's importance is still great. I'll name two things that attest to that importance. One sign of his continued greatness is the sheer amount of writing that Shakespeare inspires. The Library of Congress in Washington, D.C. has 7,000 works by Shakespeare, and that is enough reading for 20 years if one read one book a day from the collection at the Library of Congress. The Shakespeare Quarterly logs about 4,000 new works, that is, books, monographs, and other stories, every year. And the writing about Shakespeare isn't confined to just scholarly writing. There's plenty of writing about how to produce Shakespeare, how Shakespeare has been produced over the centuries, how to act in Shakespeare, how to direct Shakespeare. And there are tons of films that are created inspired by Shakespeare, and there are a series of novels inspired by Shakespeare too. How often his plays are produced on stage and for the screen is further evidence of his continued importance. In the United States alone, there are 72 Shakespeare companies working in the U.S. right now, and 3 of them are here in Maryland. So there is ample evidence that Shakespeare's importance is certainly not waning. But how did Shakespeare, growing up in Stratford-upon-Avon, a 4-day ride on horse from London, the son of a glove maker, become the cultural icon that he is today? Well, in Twelfth Night, Shakespeare wrote, "Some men are born great, some achieve greatness, and some have greatness thrust upon them." When you talk about Shakespeare and his story, I think all 3 of those apply. Shakespeare certainly was born with the capacity for greatness. His work is proof of that. But we also have to acknowledge that his greatness could not have flourished at any other time or in any other place. Part of his greatness came from when and where he lived. So part of the story is that he was born great and in a great time. He certainly did also achieve greatness, recognized even in his own day, and that achievement came from a combination of phenomenal good luck and a lot of very hard work. But even though he enjoyed all the benefits of his own success, his work and his story might have been lost to us forever if it hadn't been for the number of admirers who came after him and who preserved and kept his legacy alive. All right, so let's start by talking about how he was born great. Honestly, there was nothing in his early life that suggested that he would be great. In fact, it looked very much like he was destined to be a happy, anonymous person and live life as a middle-class citizen of a small rural town. Shakespeare was born in 1564 to John and Mary Shakespeare. John, his father, as mentioned before, worked with fine leather and made gloves, among other things. John also had political ambitions, and he worked his way up through various offices in Stratford-upon-Avon government to become the town bailiff, what we would maybe recognize as the mayor of the town. William Shakespeare's mother was from a prosperous and important family, the Ardens, and this is the family Arden cottage where Mary Arden grew up. So Shakespeare's family was well off enough that Shakespeare could go to school, which he did, and there he learned Latin, he read classical stories, and he acted in Latin plays. If Shakespeare's life had gone as it appeared to be going, he might have gone to university or followed in his father's business, and he might never have left Stratford-upon-Avon at all. However, two things happened. One, His father's business failed. He lost his position as bailiff, and he was involved in several lawsuits at the same time. And he stopped going to church, probably to avoid creditors. All of a sudden, the family was in trouble. Shakespeare had to leave school at the age of 15, and though that sounds like an unfortunate turn, it really might have been fortuitous, as we shall see later. If he had gone on to the university, it might have ruined his ability to write good plays. The second thing that happened to William Shakespeare was that, well, he got married. In 1582, he hastily married, at the age of 18, a woman 8 years older than him, Anne Hathaway, who was 3 months pregnant at the time of their wedding. This is the house where she grew up. All of a sudden, Shakespeare needed to make a living. As a married man, he was ineligible to go to the university anymore, and he couldn't become an apprentice in any other trade other than his father's. So what did he do? Frankly, we don't know. All we know for sure is that in 1592, 10 years after his marriage, we find him firmly settled in London as a successful actor and as a rising young playwright. How he got there, we don't know for sure. We don't know if he found his way to London on purpose or by accident. We don't know if he went into the theater out of a kind of compulsive artistic ambition, which frankly is unlikely for a lot of reasons, or if he just stumbled upon the profession by a series of fateful events. We don't know. All we know is that by 1592, he was well on his way to being a success in the theater. And Elizabethan England was the perfect place and time for him to become Shakespeare. As I said before, his greatness owes a lot to when and where he worked. First, he lived during the first time in English history where books were readily available to almost everyone. Printing made books accessible and affordable, and to someone like Shakespeare, who, as an up-and-coming writer, he needed to find source materials for his plays, and this was an important component to his success. The second great phenomenon that made it possible for Shakespeare to become Shakespeare was the advent of the professional theater. By the time Shakespeare arrived in London, the professional was no more than 20 years old. Imagine, theater was newer to Shakespeare than television is to us. Before the Red Lion Theater opened in 1567, there really was no such thing as a theater building or a professional acting company. On this illustration of London during his period, you can see these little arenas with flags on top of those. There are 4 of them here. These are the 4 theaters that were found on the south bank of the Thames. So prior to the time of the Red Lion Theater, plays were performed by amateurs in courtyards and in public places, and they were almost exclusively based on religious themes. Here we see 2 illustrations of plays being performed outside for religious holidays. But with the conflict between Protestantism and Catholicism in England, Queen Elizabeth I banned all religious plays. And so was born the highly popular, new, secular, professional theater. This is a map around 1600 of all the theaters that dotted London at the time. It is estimated that during the 75 years between the opening of the first professional theater and the closing of the theater by the Puritans, 50 million paying customers went to the theater in London. Shakespeare was lucky to have become associated with this group of gentlemen, the Lord Chamberlain's men. Let me explain one thing. The profession of acting was considered so disreputable that theater companies had to have sponsors, had to have patrons who were either in high places in government or nobility. And so this particular company was known as the Lord Chamberlain's men. And fortunately for Shakespeare, the Lord Chamberlain's men was considered to be the best company in London. And in the estimation of one foreign visitor who wrote, They are the best players in the world, and they were the best players in the world in large measure due to this actor, Richard Burbage, who was such a great actor that he originated many of Shakespeare's best characters, such as Hamlet, Macbeth, King Lear, and others. And Richard Burbage was known at the time for not only speaking verse beautifully, but also bringing to his acting a kind of naturalism, a kind of realism that was unusual for that time. But the Lord Chamberlain's men were also well known and successful because of Shakespeare's plays. In particular, what made his plays popular, especially in the early part of his career, were his history plays. England was in love with its own history, and Shakespeare figured that out and began writing plays based on English history, particularly as they were described in Holinshed's Chronicles. The history plays were a huge success, and they launched Shakespeare's writing career. The company also owned a theater building called at first the Theater, not very original, but it was one of the first theaters. And later, when the company dismantled the theater and moved it across the Thames to the South Bank, they renamed it the Globe. A big part of Shakespeare's success can be attributed to the fact that he wrote with very specific actors in mind. He knew their strengths, he knew their weaknesses, he knew what they could do, and he could write so that they shone in their performances. He also was successful because he was writing for a specific theater space. Before we go on, let's have a word about the nature of theater in the time of Shakespeare. This is an illustration that shows a little bit of a cutaway of what the Globe Theater might have looked like. We have to keep in mind that Shakespeare really had to write plays that appealed to a very wide and diverse audience. Everybody in the London society went to the plays. If you paid a penny, you could stand down here on the ground just below the stage and look up at the stage. Or if you had a little bit more money, you could buy a seat at this level, a little bit more here, and then finally, I think you could pay 4 pennies and sit in these tiered seats here looking down. Later on, when the theater company opened an indoor theater, the Blackfriars Theater, to complement the Globe, people could actually pay a little extra and sit right on the stage so they could be seen. So if you had a new suit of clothing and you wanted everybody in London to see it and admire it, you could actually sit on the stage. In his book, Will in the World, Stephen Greenblatt writes, "To survive economically, it was not enough to mount 1 or 2 successful plays a season and keep them running for a reasonable run. The companies had to induce people, large numbers of people, to get in the habit of coming to the theater again and again, and this meant a constantly changing repertoire, as many as 5 or 6 plays per week." The theaters were also competing with other popular entertainments, such as cockfighting, bear baiting, and public executions. The 2 illustrations on the right, both the one above and below, are illustrations of bear baiting. Bear baiting was a sport where a bear was chained to a stake in the middle of an arena. Hungry dogs were released, and the sport was to see whether the bear was able to kill all of the dogs, or if all of the dogs were able to kill the bear. You'll notice this illustration on the left. This is a bear baiting arena. My goodness, it looks very much like the Globe Theater, doesn't it? So here is where we begin to see Shakespeare's genius. We have to remember that Shakespeare did not set out to write great literature. He wrote to make money in the theater. He wrote to attract a wide audience, a paying audience, to come into the theater. He just happened to have this amazing capacity to write in ways that no one had ever written before, and which remained memorable to generations after he died. In 1592, a rival playwright, Robert Greene, criticized Shakespeare for his lack of education. He called him an upstart crow, beautified with our feathers, meaning he thought Shakespeare was coming into the theater of London without the formal background that other playwrights like he had. Most playwrights at the time were university educated, and some people have argued, like author Isaac Asimov and author Bill Bryson, that it was because Shakespeare hadn't gone to university that he was able to bend or simply ignore all the established rules of drama. He had enough education to read the classics and to pick up stories where he needed to that he knew would be popular, but he also wrote to appeal to people in theatrical, not academic ways. Author Anthony Burgess writes, "He gave the less educated individuals the horseplay and the slapstick that they enjoyed, and he gave the more educated individuals a wealth of illusion." Another mark of Shakespeare's genius was this: the theaters had very little stage effects. There wasn't enough time. There wasn't enough money. There wasn't even the technology, really, to create a new, realistic stage for every play. Remember, the company may have had to change the bill 5 or 6 times a week. The prologue to Henry V explains how it worked. A guy, and these two pictures are from Laurence Olivier's film version of Henry V. The one above is the model that he used to show London in Shakespeare's day, and then the illustration on the lower right is a picture of the prologue in that film. Anyway, so the man comes to the front of the stage, and he essentially says, and I'm paraphrasing a little bit at this time, "Wouldn't it be great if we had a kingdom for a stage? Wouldn't it be great if we had monarchs to watch the play unfold? What if, all of France could be fitted on this stage?" And then he goes on to say, "Pardon, gentles all, the flat, unraised spirits that have dared on this unworthy scaffold to bring forth so great an object." And then he goes on to say, "On your imaginary forces work. Think when we talk of horses that you see them, printing their proud hooves in the receiving earth, for 'tis your thoughts that now must deck our kings, carry them here and there, jumping o'er times, turning the accomplishments of many years into an hourglass." So how did Shakespeare's theater work? Well, Shakespeare himself, with his words, conjured the environment of the play. He told the audience if it was night or day, or if it was cold or warm, if it was in a court or in a forest. Shakespeare conjured the images with his words and let the audience imagine them. Shakespeare's words are so potent and his imagery is so vivid that the theater makers didn't need sets. They didn't need elaborate sound effects, although they had some, and they didn't have any special lighting. They just had the sun. It was all in the audience's minds. Incidentally, it's commonly accepted that Shakespeare himself spoke the prologue to Henry V. So at the same time that Shakespeare was writing for a popular audience, he also revolutionized drama by inventing the illusion of a character's inner life. By 1600, Greenblatt writes, Shakespeare had done something very special, something that no one had ever done before. He had perfected the means to represent inwardness. Today, we're used to thinking about characters in terms of psychology. We think of it in terms of, method acting that plays character from the inside out. But in Shakespeare's day, he really invented the ability for a character to look within himself, to harbor doubts, to struggle within, and to reveal either pain or joy. Another sign of Shakespeare's genius is how much of early modern English Shakespeare invented. We have to remember that when Shakespeare was writing modern English, that is, the English that we still speak today, was really in its infancy. It was just beginning to formulate. And the interesting thing is that Shakespeare himself not only took advantage of this kind of new and evolving language, but he is actually credited with having coined some 1,700 words and phrases that didn't exist before. And one source puts that list at 2,035 words. Shakespeare may not have invented all of those words and phrases. He might have just been the first person to write some of them down. But most scholars give him credit for most of the creation of those 1,700 to 2,035 new words and phrases. In the play Hamlet alone, there are 600 new words that had never been used in a play before. Isaac Asimov, the writer who was also a Shakespearean scholar, tells a story in one of his books about a woman who reads Hamlet for the first time, and she shrugs and goes, I don't get it. I don't see what all the fuss is. It just seemed like Shakespeare was just stringing together a whole series of cliches. Well, what she didn't get was that Shakespeare had coined all of those cliches. So, one very important sign that Shakespeare had achieved greatness in his lifetime is this. In 1603, Elizabeth I died, and she was succeeded by James I, who had been James VI of Scotland, her nephew. And James I loved theater, and so when he got to London, he asked around what was the best theater company in London, and somebody pointed out the Lord Chamberlain's Men, and very soon after that, the Lord Chamberlain's Men became the King's Men, and the company received all the recognition and benefits that came with the King's sponsorship. In this picture on the right, you see James I walking to his inauguration under a canopy. That canopy was upheld by these 4 posts, and those posts were upheld by 4 members of the King's Men, including Shakespeare. So, in 1616, Shakespeare dies, and when he dies, he was a very wealthy man, and he bought his family a coat of arms, and he officially became a gentleman. But even with all this success, his work and his writings might have disappeared except for a long list of admirers who kept his work alive long after his death. This is the part where greatness was thrust upon him. I'm going to mention 4 influential people who had a great deal with Shakespeare not disappearing into obscurity. So, on this list of the principal actors of the King's Men, you'll see this name here, John Hemmings, right under Richard Burbage, and down here, Henry Condell. In 1623, these 2 men, 2 of the only actors left from the company, original company, decided to put all of Shakespeare's plays, or at least 36 of his plays, into a publication, and they created the first folio of Shakespeare's complete plays. Bill Bryson, calls these 2 actors the greatest literary heroes of all time. One of the reasons why he says that is because in this first folio publication, half of the 36 plays in this edition had never been printed before. And if Hemmings and Condell hadn't put this publication together, much of Shakespeare's work might have been lost forever. In fact, there is evidence that some of his plays are lost, like the play Love's Labour's Found, which was never found, and The True History of Cardenio. Stephen Greenblatt writes, "The world owes Hemmings and Condell an immense debt." So, soon after the publication of the first folios, an historical event happened that still might have wiped out Shakespeare's memory, and that was the Puritan Revolution, the interregnum between 1649 and 1660. During that time, James I's son, Charles I, was beheaded. The Puritans took over the government, and one of the first things they did was they closed all the theaters because they felt that they were subversive, that the theater was dangerous. When the theater finally did come back in 1660, 21 years later, there were very few around who even remembered how the theater was before, and certainly none of the actors from Shakespeare's company were still around unless they had been boy actors. And when Charles II, Charles I's son, was returned from exile to resume the throne, he had been exiled to France, and his taste in theater had become most decidedly French. Here is an illustration of a restoration play during the time of Charles II. You will see a number of things. One is, it is an indoor theater. There is a very elaborate set or stage painting behind the actors. There is the introduction of an actress. In Shakespeare's day, women were not allowed on stage. This is a play called Love in a Tub. So during the Restoration period, new theaters rose up. There were two in particular that were given the license by Charles II to perform. Some of Shakespeare's plays were revised, but they didn't enjoy anything like the popularity that they had had before. And it became very common for some of his plays or portions of his plays to be rewritten, to either give them happy endings, as in the case of Tatum's King Lear, which ends happily, or they added a little bit more sexual innuendo according to the taste of the time. It seems odd to me because certainly Shakespeare's plays have plenty of sexual innuendo, but maybe there wasn't enough. But during this period, Shakespeare was luckily saved from possible obscurity or complete alteration by this man, David Garrick, the actor-manager of the Drury Lane and theatrical entrepreneur. In 1741, David Garrick was studying to become a lawyer, and he was working as a wine merchant in business with his brother. And he had been acting under a pseudonym or a series of pseudonyms in the countryside. But then one day he came in and acted the part of Richard III, again at the Drury Lane Theater, and again under a pseudonym. And he did it under a false name because the theater was still considered disreputable and he didn't want to hurt his wine business. But he was such a huge success. Virtually overnight, he was recognized as the new great Shakespearean actor. And he went on for several decades. And during that time, he appreciated Shakespeare's genius like no other actor-manager of the time. And more than any other individual in the theater of the time, he brought back Shakespeare to the stage and into people's awareness. This illustration above right is a picture of Garrick in the role of Richard III. Now, Garrick also followed the habit of the time of rewriting big sections of the play to suit the taste of the times, or if he wanted a happier ending and that sort of thing. But he also restored much of the text that had been altered by other people. So one other way in which David Garrick made Shakespeare's legacy live on was that in 1769, he hosted the Shakespeare Jubilee in Stratford-upon-Avon, and that began the Shakespeare tourist industry that city still enjoys and which is enjoyed in other cities around the world. There's a pub in Stratford-upon-Avon that is named after David Garrick. It's called the Garrick Inn, and it is one of my favorite places to get shepherd's pie. So after Garrick, generations of actor-managers kept Shakespeare alive, but we're going to jump ahead to the 20th century to meet the next great advocate of Shakespeare, this actor, Sam Wanamaker. Sam Wanamaker was born in the United States and in the 30s, and he acted in movies and on stage in the 40s, and he was very outspoken against McCarthy-era Hollywood blacklisting and the hearings. So he was hired for a job in England to work as a stage actor in 1949, and on one of his day offs, he went in search of the Globe Theater, and he didn't find it because it no longer existed. All he found was a small, darkened plaque that said that the Globe Theater had once stood here, and he was very disappointed. In the following year, 1950, he finally moved to Great Britain permanently. He became a citizen of Great Britain. And in 1970, 20 years later, he started the Shakespeare Globe Trust. In all of those years, from the 1950s on into the 1990s, Sam Wanamaker worked tirelessly to have the New Globe Theater built and the New Globe Foundation financed. Unfortunately, Sam Wanamaker died in 1994, 3 years before the realization of his dream, the opening of the Globe Theater in 1997. But as a result of the work that Sam Wanamaker did and the work at the New Globe Theater, theater makers and theater audiences are finally getting to understand the way in which the theaters of Shakespeare's day worked. And it's very different from what we're used to in the modern theater. The actors realize now that it had to be a much more popular theater than we have grown to believe. It wasn't a theater of sort of classical, highbrow attitudes. It was a popular theater where the actors looked right into the eyes of the audience and talked right to them. It was immediate and it was familiar. It was not distant and lofty. So, some men are born great, some achieve greatness, and others have greatness thrust upon them. I hope you've seen that in Shakespeare's case, a little of all three of those have been the case that have allowed a glovemaker's son to leave a legacy that carries on even now, 400 years after his death. I'll end with this quote by Ben Jonson. Ben Jonson was a contemporary playwright, sometimes a rival, often a friend of Shakespeare's. And at the time of Shakespeare's death, he wrote, "He was not of an age, but for all time." Thank you.